The year is 2011, with so many exciting new games launching like Arkham City, Dead Space 2, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Portal 2, Thor God of Thunder, wait what? And, a little indie game from Bethesda called Skyrim. Like, imagine launching in the same year as Skyrim, you might as well just give up. But even though you had all these cool new games launching after years of hype, there was one game that everyone was excited for. A new IP from Japan that would push the mighty PS3 and Xbox 360 to their limits. A game known for its breathtaking graphics, intense boss battles, and intricate level designs. And the name of this game was Dark Souls. Okay, maybe I overplayed the hype, because at this point Dark Souls was still an unknown series, and its predecessor, Demon Souls, was considered a failure. So it probably didn't sell that well, right? Wrong, because Dark Souls redefined the concept of difficulty and changed the gaming world forever. It sold over 3.2 million copies on console before releasing a massively glitchy PC port so the gaming master race could spend all their time releasing fan fixes instead of actually playing Dark Souls. The most shocking fact is that this game wouldn't even exist if its creator Miyazaki hadn't lied to Sony. You see, the execs at Sony wanted more of the stuff that was already selling. Uncharted, God of War, Killzone. Taking a huge risk with a challenging game like Dark Souls, which mercilessly punished you for mistakes, was considered unnecessary. But Miyazaki persisted, and so did fans of the original Demon Souls. While Demon Souls was a total dud in Japan, selling just 100,000 copies, it was a massive critical and commercial success in America, where people loved its novel approach to storytelling and world building. We also got our fair share of controversy, with people complaining about the clunky controls and lack of precision in your character's movement. If you went on a gaming forum back then, yes, they were still a thing, you'd come across horror stories of how Dark Souls is the worst thing ever and that it's hard just for the sake of being hard. Despite all this, the game's success showed other studios that you didn't need overproduced 1-hour-long cinematic cutscenes to be interesting. Players were exploring the world of Dark Souls not because the game told them where to go, but because they were guided by natural curiosity. Let's rewind the clock back to 2008. No matter how you look at it, this was a year of extremes. We were treated to the exceptionally good Dark Knight, which redefined superhero movies forever. But we also lost a young Heath Ledger during his prime. Britney Spears was making a comeback with her new album Circus, only weeks after the Twilight Saga had bored us to death with its melodramatic high school vampire drama. Barack Obama's election meant that people under the age of 60 were now interested in politics, but it came in the middle of a global financial crisis. Still, this depression couldn't stop people from queuing up in millions to buy the newest Call of Duty game, or the much-hyped GTA 4, which, despite being tied up in pre-release controversy over its ultra-realistic depictions of violence, became the fastest-selling video game of all time and broke 3 different Guinness Book records. For us gamers, 2008 was a monumental step forward in many ways. Video games were finally mainstream, we were seeing them in everything from TV ads to late-night talk shows. If, as a kid, you watched the marketing material and trailers for Halo back then, you know what I'm talking about. We were now living in a time when video games featured movie-level dialogue, movie-level voice acting, and movie-level cutscenes. All very neat and professional, directed by big-shot Hollywood types who had worked in cinema and TV shows for their entire life. And there was the problem. Games had become too much like movies. They'd lost their soul, what made them different in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I was mesmerized when I first played Halo 3 and saw that intro where Cortana talks about why she chose Master Chief. My skin tingled with excitement as I rushed out of a sinking freight ship with Captain Price in the opening mission of Modern Warfare 1. However, the issue starts arising once you substitute gameplay with scripted train rides that are just interactive cutscenes. We saw a lot of this in Uncharted, God of War, and yes, even the magnificent GTA 4. It felt like video game design was flash frozen, even as developmental budgets ballooned out of proportion into the hundreds of millions. Where was all this money going, and why was it beginning to feel like gaming had stagnated despite immense leaps in technology? As it turns out, there was a guy from Japan wondering the same thing back in the early 2000s. He felt games had become too detached from their roots in a vain attempt to emulate movies. So naturally, he decided to fix things by himself. And how did he plan on doing it? Of course, by creating his own multi-million-dollar dream project that defied every established convention of game design and mercilessly punished players for making the smallest of mistakes. At the time, Hidetaka Miyazaki, the father of Dark Souls, was considered to be more of a rebel than a successful game director. He didn't even have any real experience because he had spent the entirety of his 20s working as an accounts manager at Oracle to pay for his sister's tuition fees. And when you look into his history, Miyazaki wasn't even a gamer. Not because he didn't like games, but because he'd been born into a poor household and his parents could barely afford books, let alone game consoles. Despite this, Miyazaki's passion and curiosity drove him to borrow books from the local library, even though these English texts were beyond the reading ability of a Japanese child. You know what's the most fascinating thing? Miyazaki didn't care one bit. He filled in the blanks using his imagination and the illustrations on the pages of these books. Miyazaki read lots of sci-fi and fantasy novels as they were his favorite. This philosophy of using your curiosity and imagination to fill in the blanks also applies to every single Souls game, from the original Demon's Souls to Elden Ring. None of them hold your hand or give any explanation for why things are happening. You have to venture outside, explore new areas, and join the pieces of the puzzle together using your imagination. It's all there, you just need the courage to find it. As he grew older, Miyazaki got his hands on tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons. While his parents had strict rules saying no video games until college, Miyazaki was free to experiment with pen and paper games. Looking back, it's clear how the artwork and lore in Dark Souls are inspired by tabletop RPGs. He also loved manga, particularly Berserk. This is clear when you compare the design for Artorias to Guts in his Berserker armor. You might think a man with such a rich and varied knowledge of storytelling across different formats would immediately be welcomed into an early 2000s game studio. And you'd be wrong. In fact, Miyazaki stumbled into FromSoft through sheer luck. He was simply too old and inexperienced to be hired by the hyper-competitive Japanese games industry. At the age of 29, Miyazaki took the job at FromSoft despite it paying less than his old IT job, because he had fallen in love with video games after playing Ico in 2001. And he was hired just in time, because one of the teams was really struggling with this concept for a game called Demon's Souls. They had no prototype, no vision for what it was supposed to be, and the whole thing was going to be cancelled. Did you know that originally Demon's Souls was supposed to be a sequel to King's Field 4? That's right, the now legendary Demon's Souls didn't look anything like a Souls game in the early stages. However, Miyazaki cleverly repurposed the design elements from King's Field to power his dream project, a game that would feature giant interconnected levels, tough boss fights, and art design unlike anything else at the time. This is where the Souls-like genre was born, led by Miyazaki's desire to create something new and refreshing in a gaming industry that had gone stale with scripted cinematic stuff. Demon's Souls would be gameplay-focused and tell its story through world design instead of cutscenes. There would be no background music. Instead, your ears were constantly haunted by the eerie silence that was occasionally broken by the painful groans of undead creatures in the distance. At this point, most of you are probably thinking, wow, that's so cool. I bet Sony gave him a blank check and complete freedom to fulfill his vision. And again, you'd be very, very wrong. You see, not only did Sony not give him complete freedom, but they were actively trying to kill the project. Sony executives believed that Miyazaki's game was fundamentally flawed. They were experts at recreating the same old formula to milk money from old fans, and thought that something so radical and challenging would immediately turn away gamers. In fact, the president of Sony Interactive Entertainment, Shuhei Yoshida, spent 2 hours playing Demon's Souls when it was close to finished. His reaction? This is an unbelievably bad game. His words, not mine. After 2 hours, Yoshida hadn't even beaten the initial tutorial area, so he put down the controller and walked away in disappointment, probably thinking that Sony was about to lose a lot of money. This was already soul-crushing for Miyazaki, seeing his boss hate the game he had put so much passion into. But when he finally unveiled Demon's Souls for the first time in 2008 at the Tokyo Games Show, things got even worse. Fans who played an early preview of the game said it felt unfinished. Most walked away after just 10 minutes because they didn't find it enjoyable. At this point, Demon's Souls was shaping up to be a disaster, just months before its official release. But Miyazaki knew from the beginning that this was a possibility. In fact, he stated in an interview that one of the reasons he got involved in the project was because it was already considered a failure during development. And if the worst were to happen after release, nobody would care because it was supposed to happen. The game released to a lukewarm reception in Japan, but sold really well overseas, which prompted Sony Interactive's president, Yoshida, to reconsider his initial thoughts on the game. Fans were clamoring for something new and exciting, and Dark Souls aimed to provide just that. It was a spiritual successor to Demon's Souls, only this time it wasn't a PlayStation exclusive and launched on more platforms so more people could join in the madness. Almost immediately, Dark Souls became a cult classic and commercial success, selling over 2 million copies on PlayStation alone. It was so good that Sony immediately made a deal with FromSoft for Bloodborne and gave Miyazaki his blank check. This time, he was free to do anything he wanted, free to create the ideal version of his dream game. Ironic, isn't it, after all the developmental troubles and low expectations surrounding Demon's Souls just a few years ago? The cherry on top is that Shuhei Yoshida, the president of Sony Interactive, who previously hated Demon's Souls, personally came on stage to introduce Bloodborne at the 2014 E3. He's even said that the game is very near to his heart, and that he has a lot of history with the developer. You just know that behind the scenes, the man worked hard to make up for his mistakes in 2008. Now that's what I call a redemption arc. Later, we even got a video of him playing the game on PS4 and showing off his skills by beating one of the hardest bosses. Who knew the president of the company was secretly a hardcore gamer? Dark Souls revolutionized how we look at difficulty in video games. It changed the concept of open-world level design and made boss fights cool again. Modern games like Hollow Knight and Hades continue that legacy to this day. They feature the same gritty world building, unforgiving yet beautiful level design, and challenging gameplay that requires hundreds of hours to understand, yet feels incredibly rewarding when you finally master it. It paved the way for games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, Monster Hunter World, and Witcher 3. All of these have giant open worlds filled with mobs and mini-bosses that can overwhelm beginning players. Cuphead is another such game. You can lose 30 minutes of progress with one misstep, yet it was positively received by gamers and critics who praised its innovative boss battles and challenging world. Today, Dark Souls has become synonymous with how hard something is. We say Cuphead is the Dark Souls of platformers, or DMC3 is the Dark Souls of the Devil May Cry series. In an industry filled with insultingly easy games, Dark Souls was a breath of fresh air. It showed that gamers weren't scared of a challenge and that they preferred gameplay over cinematics. Dark Souls inspired other developers to spend more time on designing intricate levels with lots of cool little hidden bits and secret encounters, just like games used to do in the 1980s and 1990s, back during the 2D era. We had somehow forgotten all of it, and Dark Souls reminded us of how fun and unique gaming is as a form of art. Games can touch you on an emotional level and transport you into a whole other world, but they don't need to copy movies for this. Of course, not everyone saw things the same way, and many were quick to criticize the Souls games for their deliberately clunky controls and slow pacing. If you ever go on Reddit or Twitter, you'll find countless posts complaining about the uncancelable animations and tiny stamina bar. And underneath, there will be an army of Dark Souls fans defending their favorite franchise from the hateful influence of outsiders. Look, I don't think Dark Souls is some secretly hidden gem. After all, this series has already sold over 35 million units and has had an immense impact on the other games to the point where Souls-like is its own genre. Plus, a game with this many players isn't some obscure mountain of a challenge that nobody can climb. Even those with no prior experience in action games have played and beaten Dark Souls. All it takes is a bit of patience and the desire to get outside of your comfort zone. Dark Souls doesn't have clunky controls by accident. It's on purpose to make the combat feel weightier and more methodical. I like to think of Dark Souls as being a tactical game, in which you come up with plans for each enemy type and area. Where to stand, which direction to dodge roll, which weapons to use, etc. If you think about it, this game is nothing like DMC or God of War. It's not fast and flashy, but slow and deliberate. In a weird way, playing Dark Souls is quite a soothing experience. Almost calm and peaceful. Once you've made it past your first 300 deaths, that is. Graphically, the Souls franchise was never renowned for its poster boy good looks. However, the gothic dark fantasy-inspired art design still holds up from the original Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, both of which are well over a decade old by now. I'm of the opinion that technical prowess isn't as important as art design. Look at the SNES games from the 90s like Chrono Trigger, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Mario RPG. They look better than some early PS1 games, even though they're in 2D. Zelda on Switch looks breathtakingly beautiful, even though the console it's running on has the graphical prowess of a Casio calculator. Maybe all those years of reading manga and fantasy novels paid off for Miyazaki. He truly understands how to create memorable-looking enemies and gorgeous environments that encourage you to explore deeper and further. I had never played a Souls game until Elden Ring, and bought it after seeing all the hype. I'm by no means someone who enjoys bragging about beating a difficult game, nor do I think making a game artificially hard is a good way to engage the player. However, I was immediately hooked by the amazing level design and variety of Elden Ring. The game was hard at first, but also gave you the option to simply level up your character and come back for round 2. Or 20, against that one boss who kept killing you earlier. It was an open world without a map that told you where to go and what to do. Instead, you explored areas at your own leisure and made your own story. Going back and playing through the old Souls games showed me how far the series has come. And the earth-shattering sales of Elden Ring prove that Miyazaki's magic is still relevant today. I hope FromSoft continues to make Souls games in the future. It'll be really exciting to see what new ideas they can come up with. With consoles like the PS5 and Xbox Series X, there's just so much potential waiting to be explored, and we've only seen a small portion of it with Elden Ring. In an industry awash with recycled ideas, remakes, and demakes, the Souls series is the only one that has, well, kept its soul intact.